Hi, good afternoon if you are on the West Coast or East Coast rather. Good morning if you're out west, including our friends way out in the islands. Hope everyone is doing well. We're so pleased to be back with you. You're listening to Analyzing the U.S. Department of Education's new distance education rule, which is part of the 2020-2021 Thompson Coburn Higher Education webinar series. Let's go ahead and get started with some housekeeping, and then we'll start moving into the presentation. If you have questions during the webcast, you are always welcome to submit them through the Q&A widget there at the bottom of your screen. We're going to try to get to all of those. We've been quite intentional. We listened to your feedback, and we've been quite intentional today about trying to leave time for questions, and we hope to get through them. So if you've got them, put them in the Q&A widget, and we'll get to them at the end. A copy of the slide deck is available in the resource widget, also there at the bottom of the screen, and we always encourage you to check that out and download any resources during any of our presentations that you may find useful. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the help widget. We're all about widgets here. They're at the bottom of the screen. And then finally, this webinar is CLE accredited, so for the lawyers who are on, that's continuing legal education, as you know. It's accredited for CLE in California, Illinois for 1.5 hours, general CLE credit, and in Missouri for 1.8 hours. You get more credit in Missouri when you do CLE. 1.5 hours of general CLE credit in Texas is also pending. Keep in mind, we award CLE based on attendance for the entire 90 minutes. So please hang in there if you are here for CLE. From time to time, you'll see a pop-up screen that you can just click on to reflect your continued engagement. And then finally, as always, at the end, there will be an opportunity for you to complete a post-webinar survey. And we are very grateful for all the comments that we get, and we do read them. And as you always hear me say, we try hard to make every webinar better than the one before. If you don't know who we are, by the way, Thompson Coburn is a law firm. I always like to just clarify that for folks who may be new to us. Pretty big firm, over 380 attorneys. We have offices around the country, including in Chicago, Los Angeles, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C., where Katie Wendell is located today. I'm sitting in St. Louis, though I can't see the arch. Like many of you, I suspect, I'm working out of the home office today. We have a higher education practice. There's some of the fine people on that practice. These are individuals who work either full-time exclusively with higher ed or a lot of the time with higher ed, doing a wide range of things, legal, regulatory, transactional, you name it. I mentioned earlier, this is part of our higher education webinar series. Thompson Coburn started its webinar series, I guess, 3 years ago. And this year, typically we kick off in August, but with everything going on this year, particularly over the summer, higher education relief funds and CARES Act and Title IX rules and whatnot, and not to mention all of you just trying to get stuff together and figure out how you're going to approach the fall, we decided to hold off and to launch a little later this year. So this is the first in the series in September. Next month, boy, particularly for this crowd, I encourage you, Jim Shreve, the head of our cybersecurity practice, along with some folks from SpearTip and Katie, are going to do a presentation on securing endpoints. And if you're not a cybersecurity type, I have learned that by endpoints we mean as you are expanding your cybersecurity and network presence out further and further, your endpoints of that infrastructure move, and it becomes difficult and complex trying to secure those endpoints. And Jim and Katie and others are going to really focus on that concept. Should be a really interesting presentation. We'll get information out to you soon in the way of an alert letting you know the date and time for that presentation. In November, our lobbyists that specialize in higher ed out of DC, Chris Murray, Ken Solomon, and others are going to do a post-election debriefing on the impact of the election on higher education, assuming by that point in November that we have some sense as to the outcome of these races, fingers crossed. And then in December, I will be doing, along with a couple other folks I expect, a year-end roundup of the U.S. Department of Education's rulemaking activity this year, which includes this rule we're talking about today, along with a lot of other things. So I am joined today by Katie Wendell, who is counsel in our higher ed practice, hailing out of our Washington, D.C. office. Katie does a wide range of things, has been in the business for a very long time and really focuses on regulatory issues around the federal financial aid programs. I have known Katie for over a decade. She is a good friend and colleague. And as I mentioned earlier, she also does a fair amount on the cybersecurity front, and you'll hear from her next month. And there's me, in case you haven't seen me before, doing my best impression of a man auditioning for Dead Poet Society in the local theater production. I have been the chair and partner here at the higher education practice and do a lot of different work for institutions of higher education on all different fronts and have for a very long time. So we're glad you're here today. Here's the syllabus. In other words, the outline for the presentation. We're going to start just with a brief overview of the accreditation and innovation rulemaking. It's been a little wonky the way it's been carried out, and we just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Then we're going to focus on this new definition of distance education. Katie's going to take over and talk about clock and credit hours in the distance education context, new definitions for academic year and instructional time, and new provisions for direct assessment programs. And then finally, we have our new little section here in case you missed it. Like a lot of these rulemakings, this one involves a lot of different pieces. Most of it's about distance education, a lot of concepts around innovation, but there are also some little things that have been slipped in that we wanted to be sure to call your attention. And then we'll round out the presentation with just a reference to a couple of resources for you. So, deep breath. With all of that being said, let's move into the rulemaking and just talk about how we got here. So, you know, the U.S. Department of Ed over the last 3 or 4 years, and even going back to the prior administration, has been engaged in a level of rulemaking that is really unprecedented. And the last 3 or 4 rulemaking efforts, and I'll say that includes accreditation and innovation, bar defense, and even to some extent gainful employment and Title IX, have tackled a really wide range of topics. But accreditation and innovation was, even among all of those, sort of remarkable for the range of topics that it went after. And here you see our effort just to group those into 5 or 6 different categories. You had all this discussion around accreditation agencies and their procedures and those rules that govern accreditors, state authorization of distance education programs, the old Bird's Honor Scholarship Program, teach grants, eligibility of faith-based entities, and then rules for distance and competency-based education, which is different from state authorization. And I'm drawing that distinction in particular because of where we're going to go here with the next slide. So in July of 2018, the department announced its intent to do a rulemaking covering all of these topics. And many of you will remember the immediate reaction from the higher ed community was, that's a whole lot to try to cover. Do you really think you can get there? And there was some concern expressed. The department decided to move ahead and then in early 2019 carry out its rulemaking, and to its credit and the credit of the negotiators, and I think to the surprise of many, including this guy, reached consensus, which was, I think, a big win for the department and really good for the soul of the higher education community. It's nice when occasionally folks can get together around the table and come to agreement on some things. Right? So after that, the department started into this process of putting out proposed rules and then final rules. And I said that process was a little wonky. And what I mean by that is, traditionally it has been the case that when the department does a rulemaking and they have all these topics they cover, after they come out of the rulemaking, they issue a proposed rule for all the things that were discussed in the rulemaking, and then you comment on that, and then they issue the final rule. But in this case, the department actually decided, even though they had one negotiated rulemaking round, they then decided to break up the topics and move forward in tranches. So on November 1st, you got a final rule that dealt with accreditation and state authorization. And on August 14th of 2020, almost a year later, we got the final rule relating to faith-based institutions and teach grants. And then just at the beginning of this month, September 2nd, we got the final rule covering distance education innovation, which is what we're talking about today. Just to give you enhanced sense, hopefully, about these rulemaking tranches and their effective dates, because it does matter, as those of you who spend a lot of time following departmental rulemakings know, when a final rule hits impacts when it is likely to become or when it will become effective. So the first tranche for which we got the final rule last year prior to November 1st, and this was this tranche of regulation or rulemaking that dealt with recognition of accredited agencies, state authorization of distance ed, and the Bird Honor Scholarship Program, that became effective this year, July 1, because the final rule came out last year. Both of the rulemaking packages that came out this year, the one in August and the one this month, will not become effective until July 1, 2021. I want to emphasize that for a couple of reasons. The first is that means all the stuff we're going to talk to you about today, which is the stuff that showed up in this new final rule that was published at the beginning of this month on September 2nd, none of it's effective yet, right? So we try to make sure the slides are all worded that way, and our citations all say July 1, 2021. But just keep in mind, you've got time. This new rule isn't effective yet, right? It's almost a year, 9 months or plus, before it will become effective. The other reason to highlight this is, and I was having a conversation with a very informed individual in the space just a couple of weeks ago who raised a concern about whether or not these rules that won't be effective until July 1, 2021, and that were just promulgated in final form in August and September respectively, could potentially be subject to a Congressional Review Act attack, right? So the idea here is if we, on the other side of these elections, in theory, had Democrats in charge of the White House and of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, and for whatever reason they decided they didn't like these rules, would they take advantage of a CRA action and try to kill the rules? And you may remember the current administration used the CRA to get rid of a whole lot of new rules that were promulgated in the second half of the final year of the Obama administration. And that's a technical process, and exactly which rules would be subject to it and, et cetera, is a question mark. But I'll just give you my thinking on this. I think it is likely, if you had the Democrats sweep the White House and Congress, that there would be CRA activity. And I think rules promulgated as late as these two were in August and September could be targets, and probably would fall within the range of rules that could be considered under the CRA. But I personally believe that these two particular rules, faith-based entities, teach grants, and the rule we're talking about today around distance ed and innovation, I think it would be a tall order for a subsequent administration to try to kill those outright for two reasons. One is because, as I mentioned, these rules were created after the negotiated rulemakers came to consensus. The whole idea of rulemaking and negotiated rulemaking at the department is you bring the community together and they have the input, and if they agree to consensus, the notion is that those rules really are worth something, right? I mean, there's a real sense that this is what's right and good, and people came to agreement. Now, subsequently, some folks may change their mind. Even some of the negotiated rulemakers may say, well, I don't feel like that was really the way I wanted things to go. But it doesn't change the fact that the rule was created with consensus. And I think that makes it harder, at least politically, for a subsequent administration to kill the rule. The other problem is, under the CRA, the way it's written, if you kill a rule using the CRA, in theory, Congress, or at least the U.S. Department of Education, rather, isn't supposed to regulate in that area ever again, right? So it not only kills the rule, but it has the added effect of preventing the agency from regulating on the topic on a go-forward basis. And if I'm the Democrats, even if I don't like this rule, I probably don't want to do anything that would prevent me from being able to regulate on these topics on a go-forward basis. So, my gut is, while these may be subject potentially or could be subject to CRA action, I'm looking into the crystal ball here, but it doesn't seem like the kind of rule that someone would want to get after. Okay, so what does the new rule contain? First of all, it's got a new definition of distance education. And this is important for those, and a common theme you're going to hear from us today. We, as we were putting this presentation together, are certainly mindful of those, and a number of you are on today who have been in the higher ed online distance education space for a very long time. Some of the folks tuning in, we know, have very developed platforms. But we also know there are a lot of folks on the line who may be into online and distance education for the very first time. You may have been forced there as a consequence of the pandemic. And now be thinking, we're here, we're operating in this space under sort of temporary provisions, but there seem to be advantages. It's working for some of our students. We don't know how long the pandemic is going to continue, and we want to try to transition to a model where we can be in the online space on a go-forward basis. And so it's really important, not only for the long-time participants in the space to think through whether and to what extent you all are going to need to make changes to accommodate these new rules, but for those of you who have been operating in the online space for only a brief period and under temporary provisions, it's really important that you understand that mounting and successfully operating a distance education program under the standard regulatory framework that will be applied, which will include these new rules when they become effective, is going to be a very different exercise. And as you are contemplating whether or not you want to move in this direction and be there permanently, you need to think long and hard about whether or not you're prepared to comply with these rules, among others. And you may say, yeah, we are, and we're ready to make the investment. And that's of course a great decision, and could be the best thing, could be a great decision and the best thing for your students and faculty and institution. But you want to be very thoughtful and deliberate about it because there's a lot to it. So at any rate, let's get back to distance education. The department has defined the term. The negotiators spent a lot of time talking about. This is where they came out. We're talking about education that uses one of the following technologies to deliver instruction to students who are separated from their instructors and to support regular and substantive interaction between the students and the instructors, either synchronously or asynchronously. And here are the technologies: the internet, one-way and two-way transmissions through open broadcast, closed-circuit cable, microwave, broadband lines, fiber optics, satellite wireless communication devices, audio conference, or other media, kind of broad. I think the department here trying to keep the door open for future technologies we may not even know about yet. Other media used in course in conjunction with any of the technologies listed above. 2 or 3 things to focus on here, and we're going to focus on them on subsequent slides. So this is not a totally new concept. I mean, the department had a previous definition, and they updated a little bit, but it made reference to the internet and other types of things. There was also a lot of discussion in the commentary and among the negotiators, about who's an instructor and the level of participation instructors have to have when you're thinking about these definitions. But what I really want to focus on here is this notion of regular and substantive interaction. And so we're going to break that down because it is in the heart of this definition, right? I mean, yes, you're using a technology that is being delivered over one of these, or you're delivering your education over one of these technologies here in the bullets down below, and you're talking about a scenario where you're separated from your instructor, or the instructors and the students rather are separated. But key to this whole concept is you're delivering the instruction in a way that is supporting regular and substantive interaction. And when you're talking about how is the department measuring the quality of the distance education programs that are being offered, right? Sort of what's the qualitative piece of this? Regular and substantive interaction is really where it's at, right? So let's focus on that term. So the department updated its concept of regular interaction, and this was regular and substantive interaction were concepts that were around previously, but there was a real lack of clarity around them. And I know that created a lot of heartache for a number of online institutions, both in the way of audits and program reviews and things of that nature, and also just in correspondence with the department trying to get this right because it was unclear. So one of the big tasks that the negotiated rulemakers, when they went through this process, focused on was sort of defining these concepts of regular and substantive interaction. So the department, under the new law, becomes effective July 1, 2021, has indicated, first of all, when we say regular interaction, this is what we're talking about. And I want to emphasize, you'll see on the left at the bottom after the semicolon, there's an and it's underlined. So to get regular interaction, you have to have both of these things. Let's just be real clear about that. So when we're talking about regular interaction, we're talking about distance education that is providing the opportunity for substantive interactions with the student on a predictable and scheduled basis. Originally, that language read a little bit differently, but the department, in issuing the final rule, decided that scheduled was a better sense, a better term. So we're talking about predictable and scheduled basis, commensurate with the length of time and the amount of content in the course or competency. And, okay, so the first part is you're creating this opportunity for substantive interactions with students on a predictable and scheduled basis. And monitoring the student's academic engagement and success, and ensuring that an instructor is responsible for promptly and proactively engaging in substantive interaction with the student when needed on the basis of such monitoring or upon request by the student. Okay, so there are 2 or 3 things in this definition that are really important. Probably more than 2 or 3, but we're going to focus on 2 or 3. I mean, the first is, it clearly, you don't have to get into the terms to understand that the department is expecting some real investment here, right? So particularly if you're one of the folks who's new to online education, right? I mean, there is an expectation here that you have a platform that you are utilizing, whatever that platform may be, whatever combination of technologies it may be, but you have a platform that you are utilizing that satisfies these standards, that is creating opportunity for substantive interactions, right, on a predictable and scheduled basis, that is able to monitor students' academic engagement, that you've got instructors who, through your platform, can be responsible for promptly and proactively engaging in substantive interaction. Okay, so I just want to highlight, if nothing else, that this is a fairly high bar, certainly relative to what is happening in many cases right now, where folks have moved online rapidly and are doing the best they can, which is great. We understand it's a pandemic. We're talking about past that if you're going to be in the online space for good, okay? But if you're a lawyer type like me, when you read something like this, you also start to focus in on words like monitoring. What does that mean? I mean, you know, what capability does our platform have to have so that we can monitor students? And to what extent do we have to be able to demonstrate or document after the fact that we were able and were indeed monitoring? So if I get a program review, and the department comes in and says, we need you to show us that you're monitoring students' academic engagement, how do I demonstrate that, right? And then the other question in my mind is, what the heck is academic engagement? And we have a definition of that we're going to get to in a second. I did want to highlight, there was a little bit of discussion in the commentary where the department got at some of these notions, and I want to read to you, I don't have it up on the screen, I'm just going to read it to you, but these are a couple of quotes out of the Federal Register, and they speak to these ideas that I've just been articulating. So the first is, when we talk about how to document, this is, again, out of the Federal Register. So this is the department speaking. Given the variety of distance education programs, coursework, instructional modalities, and course schedules, we do not believe it is practical to offer a specific time frame for regular interaction, which is why the department, the subcommittee, and the negotiating committee agreed to frame the requirement as an opportunity for interaction rather than a required interaction. This approach has the added benefit of allowing institutions to demonstrate compliance with the requirements at the program design level without documenting each and every interaction between students and instructors. So I thought this particular text was quite illuminating. You know, I was just talking about this concern, if you're a lawyer type, as to what's required to document that you're satisfying these standards and what the department is anticipating. And I thought it was very interesting here that the department seems to suggest that we are not actually, the agency is not going to be focused on some sort of output that you can produce that shows that a bunch of interactions actually took place. What the department is focused on is that you are creating the opportunity for substantive interactions with the student on a predictable and scheduled basis. And seems to suggest that you could document that you are satisfying this standard, right, quote, at the program design level without documenting each and every interaction between students and instructors. So for a guy who does what I do for a living, I read that and I thought, well, this is positive, right? Because the department seems to be saying it is not our expectation that you are actually tracking and recording every single interaction between your faculty and instructors and your students, and that's not what we expect to see when we ask you to show that you're complying with this first half of the standard. It would be sufficient to show that your program, when designed at the design level, built into it, is the opportunity for substantive interactions, and that would potentially satisfy the first half of this requirement. Now, I will highlight this commentary was created by the current administration. 6 months from now, you could have a different administration that may not take this view. So be wary and be thoughtful. But this at least seems positive to me insofar as this department is acknowledging that there's not an expectation that you're documenting all of these interactions, right? Which would be enormously complex, and you have all these privacy concerns because you have all these interactions that are now recorded and sitting somewhere, et cetera. So let's talk about the second half, monitoring, because I was also very interested in this. What is the department really anticipating when they say monitor? I mean, sort of like with documenting, are we somehow having to track all of the student movements and everything that they're doing and every time they touch the program? And if not, where's the line? So again, this is an excerpt from the Federal Register. The requirements for regular interaction include monitoring a student's academic engagement and success with respect to a course or competency. This requirement is not intended to mandate that instructors personally monitor each student's engagement throughout each class session while also instructing, facilitating discussion, or responding to questions from students. Instead, the requirement is intended to ensure that instructors are generally monitoring whether a student is engaged and successful throughout a given course or competency and takes appropriate action as needed. Let me read you just a little bit more that follows up on that because the department gives some examples. Such monitoring could include evaluating a student's level of participation in synchronous class sessions, but it could also involve monitoring the student's activity on course websites or materials, considering the quality of the student's assignments or responses to questions about course materials, evaluating the level of the student's understanding of course materials during conversations with instructors or performance on exams, or other forms of monitoring the student's engagement and success in the course or competencies. So again, I'm highlighting this because as a lawyer type, just like documenting, monitoring gave me heartburn when I first read it. I thought, boy, if I'm at an institution and I'm in compliance, what does that really mean? What am I going to have to do with my IT folks to figure out how to build a platform that will allow us to demonstrate monitoring? And this excerpt from the commentary, in my mind, sort of like with the documentation and the opportunity concept, here around monitoring seems to suggest some flexibility. Right? The notion is not that you have a system in place that is constantly monitoring everything that the student is doing, every type of academic engagement, but there seems to be some flexibility here. So I, again, took that to be positive, and within the context of these regulations, I think two of the places where we're going to see continued discussion in the realm of compliance is going to be around these concepts and how do schools comply with regular and substantive interaction. As I mentioned, and I know there are folks on the line who know well, these have been hotspots for institutions in the past. So it's going to be something both the traditional providers and the folks who may be new to the space really want to focus on. All right, the other term I highlighted there was academic engagement. So we have this definition of academic engagement. Some of the elements of it were pulled out of the old R2T4 regs and brought in over here. And, you know, the obligation, I talk about monitoring, but what is it you're monitoring? Academic engagement. So what does that mean? The department says the term academic engagement is defined as active participation by a student in an instructional activity related to the student's course of study. There should be an end quote there. Okay, so active participation by a student in an instructional activity related to the course study. The concept's defined by the institution, so that's positive, in accordance with any applicable requirements of the state or your accrediting agency. But, and this is important, it must include certain specific activities and it must exclude others. And in the regulation, the department includes this list of activities that are by definition included in the concept of academic engagement and others that are by definition excluded. All right, so here they are. So included, academic engagement, attending a synchronous class, lecture, recitation, field laboratory activity, physically or online, where there is an opportunity for interaction between the instructor and the students, submitting an academic assignment or taking an exam, participating in an interactive tutorial, webinar, or other interactive computer-assisted instruction, participating in a study group, group project, or an online discussion that's assigned by the institution, interacting with an instructor about academic matters. These activities are academic engagement by definition, right? So the concept of academic engagement includes these. It excludes living in institutional housing, participating in a meal plan. So you can't count somebody as academically engaged if they show up and get their yogurt, right? Logging into an online class or tutorial without further participation, or participating in academic counseling or advisement. So if you're new to the online space and the stuff in the excludes category is the stuff that you're tracking right now and using to demonstrate that the person's engaged, just keep in mind on a go-forward basis, once this rule is effective, those concepts are excluded from the notion of academic engagement. But I want to jump back a couple of slides, right? And I want to focus again on the definition of regular and substantive interaction. So to have regular interaction, by definition, the department says an institution must be monitoring the student's academic engagement, right? And then the definition of academic engagement must include the activities in this upper box. So it raises in my mind the question, does that mean that you as an institution have to have a method by which to track or monitor all of these activities to the extent that they're taking place in the context of your program? I think that's another thing that, I mean, there's some discussion around this kind of thing in the commentary, and I just read you a few moments ago what the department had to say about monitoring, and it seemed to suggest that that was a somewhat flexible concept, not something that had to be, done at every moment in real time in a class. But it does raise in my mind this question, if to demonstrate substantive interaction, we have to be able to monitor academic engagement. And academic engagement is this really fulsome concept. It suggests to me that at some point there's a line being drawn in the sand, and online providers are going to have to really be able to monitor in a meaningful way these types of activities. This brings me to another wrinkle that I don't have here in the slides, and I'll just spend a minute on. But, as many of you know, those of you who are in financial aid, the department draws a distinction when it comes to the return of Title IV between institutions that are attendance-taking and not attendance-taking. And institutions that are not attendance-taking have the flexibility of using what's called the midpoint approach, right, to calculating return of Title IV. And for a very long time, you were only an attendance-taking institution if you were actually required by some outside entity to take attendance. And so many institutions were not attendance-taking, and they used the midpoint. And then a few years ago, the department changed the regulations, and it said, well, okay, it's if you're required by an outside entity, or if the school has a policy requiring faculty to take attendance, et cetera. And a lot of institutions at that point had to reassess whether they were really attendance taking or not. And then over the last 4 or 5 years, there were a handful of case teams, one in particular, I won't call them out, but they're located in Kansas City, that did a lot of program reviews and started taking issue with a lot of institutions around attendance taking and whether they were actually attendance taking or non-attendance taking schools. Where am I going with all of this? Well, so all of this in my mind raises the question. If you're an online institution, and the whole philosophy, by the way, around attendance taking and non-attendance taking, or the reason the department changed that rule was they figured, look, at the end of the day, if someone's got the data, if they can actually tell to the day when someone ceased attending, then that's what they ought to use to process the return of Title IV. We don't need to use the midpoint, right? We can use more precise data because you have the more precise data. And, philosophically, that's it. It's pretty simple. Well, so my concern is if you're an online provider and to comply with this new distance education rule, you have to be monitoring academic engagement at this level so that you are ostensibly tracking all of the stuff in this bullet on the top half of the screen. At what point do you really have enough data that you essentially know to the day when someone has ceased attending? And what I wonder is if we're going to get to a point as schools in the online space make sure that they are complying with this regulation that you're looking at right now, that they have regular and substantive interaction, that their platforms can monitor academic engagement so that they have no concerns about satisfying these standards. Will they, on the other hand, get to a point where they essentially have daily attendance type data? And will the department come around and take the view that, what, it may be because you're satisfying this other regulation, but the fact of the matter is you've got the data and you should no longer be using the midpoint? And or will that just call into question whether somebody, is that going to come up after the fact in the context of a program review or an audit? I don't know. So, if you're out there and you're in this space, this is something you ought to be looking for. I'm interested. I know other people have thought about this. I'm not the first. And it'll be really interesting to see if there is some sort of interaction ultimately between this new rule once it becomes effective and the changes schools make and the department's view on who really is an attendance-taking institution. Substantive interaction. This is for the other half, right? So that was regular interaction. Now we're on substantive interaction. Substantive interaction is engaging students in teaching, learning, and assessment consistent with the content under discussion, and it includes at least 2 of the following. So to comply with this half of the rule, you have to be able to demonstrate with your new online platform or your existing online platform under this rule that you're knocking at least 2 of the 5 of these out of the park, right? So providing direct instruction, assessing or providing feedback on a student's coursework, providing information or responding to questions about the content of a course or competency, facilitating a group discussion regarding the content of a course or competency, other instructional activities approved by the institutions or programs accrediting agency. I think most folks will have less difficulty coming into compliance or finding a way to ensure that they are complying with this concept than the regular interaction concept. The one thing I'll just remind, though, is, it's one thing to be in compliance, it's another thing to be able to document and demonstrate that you are in compliance. So not only does your platform need to be able to do these things and meet these standards, but again, you got to be real thoughtful about, if the department comes knocking down the road, how are we going to demonstrate that we have been satisfying these standards? And, we read earlier the departments talked about program design, and the extent to which you might be able to just use that to satisfy some parts of it. Monitoring, it doesn't sound like the department's really intending you to be able to demonstrate that you're monitoring constantly. And again, program design may be able to demonstrate quite a bit to the department. But I also think at some point schools are going to be thoughtful, and we may get more guidance out of the department about what you may need in the way of documentation to satisfy their expectations or demonstrate to them that you've been satisfying those expectations. A couple other points. The department confirms in the commentary that substantive interactions take place at the course or competency level and not at the instructor level. So just again, when we're talking about even these substantive interactions on the prior slide, the notion is that you need to be able to demonstrate that that's happening in the context of the course. Competency, you don't have to demonstrate it at the instructor level. And the department also confirms that substantive interaction must be initiated by instructors. What do I mean by that? There was some question, for example, in the context of correspondence courses, that some types of interaction is actually initiated by the student. And what the department is saying here is, if you want to satisfy our substantive interaction standard, what we're talking about is substantive interactions that are initiated by instructors with, in the context of the program design and the way it's being carried. All right. So Katie, that was a whole lot of Aaron. I'm happy to turn it over to you for the next 2 or 3 sections.
Well, thanks, Aaron. I thought that was just great, Aaron. So I thought I appreciated it.
Appreciate
and
the
now we
admiration.
will. Sure. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. And we also happy to talk about clock and credit hours. So with these new regs, the department made changes to the definition of clock and credit hour for distance education. And in the case of clock hour, the definition was changed and now includes the possibility of asynchronous distance instruction. Just the slide here we have says the rule includes a new definition of clock hour for distance education. Specifically, in distance ed, a clock hour is 50 to 60 minutes in a 60-minute period of attendance in a synchronous or asynchronous class, lecture, or recitation where there is opportunity for direct interaction between the instructor and students, or an asynchronous learning activity involving academic engagement in which the student interacts with technology that can monitor and document the amount of time that the student participates in the activity. So this kind of gets at all that Aaron, it helps support all that Aaron was just going through with respect to direct interaction and, working with the students and getting touches with them. And I wanted to mention in the Federal Register, published with the final regs, the department notes that this additional flexibility is meant to benefit students who need flexible learning schedules, whether that's because of family obligations or health concerns or otherwise. They also mention that COVID-19 and the pandemic have really brought into focus how necessary these allowances are to make education accessible for more people. Also in the Federal Register, the department stated that, and I quote, "The individual pacing made possible by asynchronous learning allows for a more tailored educational experience that promotes mastery of subject matter over attendance in scheduled activities." So they go on to say that they don't want to impede technological innovations at institutions that can help students overcome barriers to access and completion. So they really are working to expand this and help what's really going on fit into the rules. The new rule also specifically states that an institution must be capable of monitoring a student's attendance in those 50 out of 60 minutes for each clock hour under this definition. And it also specifically states that a clock hour in a distance education program does not meet the requirements of this rule if it does not meet all of its accreditor and state agency requirements, or if it exceeds an agency's or state's restrictions on the number of clock hours in a program that may be offered through distance education. So they are really undergirding all the regs by saying over and over again throughout the preamble in the Federal Register and the regulations that all of these programs still need to meet the accreditors' requirements and the state requirements. So they're really relying on those rules to keep the programs in check as well. The department remains concerned about the possibility that clock hours offered asynchronously could be used as a means to complete unsupervised homework assignments rather than coursework that otherwise would have occurred in a classroom, which is prohibited under the department's policy for clock hour programs. So this is why they are really making clear that the requirement for supervision of a clock hour in an asynchronous learning environment is only met when the institution is capable of documenting the specific form of academic engagement associated with the activity. For example, asynchronous participation in an interactive tutorial or webinar online. And the institution has technological resources and policies and procedures that can monitor and document the time each student spends performing that activity. So the school must document what the academic engagement is and properly track the time that each student spent on that activity. If either of these conditions aren't met, a school would not be allowed to include time spent on an online activity toward completion of a clock hour for purposes of distance ed for Title IV HEA programs. And then I just wanted to highlight one more thought from the Federal Register related to the change to the definition of a clock hour. It says institutions offering clock hour programs using distance education continue to be subject to the general requirements in the definition of distance education, which requires regular and substantive interaction between students and instructors. In such programs, some, but not all, clock hours would need to involve substantive interaction between students and instructors. So, again, the department is relying on the notion of regular and substantive interaction required for clock hours, and the fact, again, that accreditors and accrediting agencies and states, their requirements will still be in place to provide safeguards to ensure that students have access to quality instruction and as well as instructor support. It really hammers home the importance of understanding the department's definition of regular and substantive interaction that Erin so helpfully went through, and building that into your distance education programs to maintain eligibility. This is kind of cheesy, but like as in the Peter Parker or Spider-Man principle, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So these new rules are offering this flexibility and expansion for measuring clock and credit hours, but schools really, as Erin mentioned earlier, really need to be sure they can document everything that we just discussed when they are going through, you know, program review or an audit, because we do believe that it will need to be pretty well documented. So the new regulation defining a credit hour is meant to broaden the definition of credit hour in a way that focuses on student learning rather than seat time, and is flexible enough to account for innovations in the delivery models used by institutions. So under the new rule, a credit hour is 1 hour of student work that reasonably approximates not less than 1 hour of classroom or direct faculty instruction and a minimum of 2 hours of out-of-class student work each week, or at least an equivalent amount of work for other academic activities as established by the institution, and permits an institution in determining the amount of work associated with a credit hour to take into account a variety of delivery methods, measurements of student work, academic calendars, disciplines, and degree levels. Clearly, they really are offering up that flexibility here to allow students to measure programs in different ways depending on the nature of the courses. With this expanded definition, they are moving beyond the traditional understanding of 1 hour of class and 2 hours out of class work. And this could, in effect, allow schools to assign a larger number of credit hours to courses that they can show require more student work. The department specifically cites laboratory work, for example, and courses that include lab work or learning experiences that often require more hours of student work that isn't reflected in the number of credit hours. So this new rule allows schools to adjust for lab work and other learning modalities. Now we will discuss changes to the definition of an academic year and instructional time. The definition of academic year has long required that clock and credit hour programs include a minimum number of weeks of instructional time, but the new rule revises that definition of instructional time to include programs using asynchronous coursework. So for the first time, the department is recognizing with this new rule that instructional time will look and operate very differently for asynchronous instruction than synchronous face-to-face instruction, which, as we've discussed, is more important now than ever, now that so many students and programs have moved online, whether that's temporarily or more long-term. This significantly impacts most forms of distance education, and the new definition removes the assumption that asynchronous distance education courses must operate as default synchronous face-to-face courses by scheduling at least one day of instruction each week. So it allows our asynchronous programs a lot more flexibility under the rule. Under the new rule, in a program offered using asynchronous coursework through distance education, a week of instructional time may now include any week in which the institution makes available the instructional materials, other resources, and instructor support necessary for academic engagement and completion of course objectives, and the institution expects enrolled students to perform educational activities demonstrating that academic engagement during the week. So the new rule also specifies that instructional time does not include any scheduled breaks and activities not included in the definition of academic engagement or periods of orientation or counseling. So the department, again, is really allowing schools to build in the flexibility that so many post-secondary students need and making the reality of prevalent distance education make sense with the Title IV regulatory framework. Moving on to the changes the new rules make with respect to direct assessment programs. And as you can see on this next slide, we've got the current definition of a direct assessment program for the sake of comparison. So under the current federal regulations, a direct assessment program is one that, in lieu of credit hours or clock hours as a measure of student learning, utilizes direct assessment of student learning or recognizes the direct assessment of student learning by others. Now, for some time, there has been a push for significant revisions to the Title IV regulations governing the review and approval of direct assessment programs. In fact, as you can see here, way back in 2015, Aaron and Chris Murray, who is another colleague of ours here at Thompson Coburn, authored a paper with the American Enterprise Institute specifically calling for changes to this clunky and slow process. And from my understanding of talking about it with Aaron, tens of people reviewed this paper on reforms, and probably several tens of them enjoyed it.
Tens of people, yes. High single digits, I'm sure.
So with regard to direct assessment programs in the new rule, the new rule clarifies the eligibility requirements for a new direct assessment program. So the new rule explains that direct assessment of student learning means a measure of a student's knowledge, skills, and abilities designed to provide evidence of the student's proficiency in the relevant subject area. The rule goes on to explain that a school must establish a methodology to reasonably equate each module in the direct assessment program to either credit hours or clock hours. And then this methodology must be consistent with the requirements of the institution's accreditor or state approval agency. And I do want to note that the new rule also states that all regulatory requirements in these rules that refer to credit or clock hours as a measurement apply to direct assessment programs as well, according to whether they use credit or clock hour equivalencies, respectively. So that's something to keep in mind when setting up direct assessment programs. The new rule also limits the requirement for ED's approval to an institution's first direct assessment program at each credential level. Institutions still must report to ED when they add a second or subsequent direct assessment program, but additional direct assessment programs at an equivalent or lower academic level generally do not require further approval. So, for example, an institution will be required to get the department's approval for a Bachelor of Science in Nursing if that program is the school's first direct assessment program. Then the school could add other bachelor-level direct assessment programs without seeking the department's approval. But if the school ended up wanting to add a Master of Science in Nursing, it would be required to seek the department's approval for that one. So only the first direct assessment program in each academic level needs to get approval. I also wanted to briefly touch on the idea that credit hours and clock hours are not perfect measurements for direct assessment programs, but at this point, the department felt it was more important to get these rules in place and understands what an onerous process it will be to establish a different unit of measurement. They noted in the preamble that without such an alternative, the department will continue to use credit or clock hour equivalencies in order to ensure that an institution's choice of a unit of measurement for a direct assessment program does not result in an unfair or inflated determination of a student's eligibility for Title IV higher ed funds. Such a currency is also important in enabling students to transfer credits between institutions. So yes, it is key to students' eligibility for Title IV funds, as well as things like transfer credits, that a common currency, which in this case is credit hours and clock hours, is used for these rules. So we're so trendy, we have hashtag in case you missed it, and I am going to toss it back to Aaron to go through these items.
Thank you, ma'am. And I will tell you all, so I was very proud of this hashtag in case you missed it. I thought this was a very clever thing that I had come up with, and so I was showing it to my 12-year-old son, and those of you with 12-year-old children already know at this point in the story that I've made a critical error. And so I asked my 12-year-old son, I said, hey, what do you think of this? I think it's pretty cool, right? I mean, it's fairly trendy. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I don't think anybody who's cool or trendy really uses that. And I said, what are you talking about? I see it all the time on Facebook and LinkedIn. And he looked at me and deadpanned, yeah, but those are old people apps, Dad. So to those of you who also think this is hip and trendy, we're together and in solidarity, and thank goodness I'm not alone. But most of you probably know that I totally missed the boat. At least the 12-year-old population certainly thinks so. So what we really wanted to do here, recognizing, and I mentioned earlier, you know, a lot of these rulemakings, they'll have some topic that's the headliner, borrower defense rulemaking, you know, accreditation and innovation, although that's a little more vague, but still. And then there will be the topics you tend to talk more about, in this case, these definitions and regular and substantive interaction, direct assessment programming. But these are really broad rulemakings, and a lot of times there are little things that the department is doing in the context of these rulemakings that don't get top billing, but can be quite important. And really, the purpose of this section here, we wanted to comment on a handful of other things that are in this rule and that will become effective next year on July 1, and make sure that you were aware. And by no means is this, you know, an exhaustive list. There are other little things hidden in the regulation as well, but there were at least a few that we wanted to call out. First of all, in keeping with the theme of distance education, we thought it was interesting under the new rule, the department indicated that it's going to defer to the requirements established by an institution's accrediting agency or state authorizing agency when evaluating an institution's appeal of a final audit or program review determination that includes a finding about the institution's classification of a course or program as distance education or the institution's assignment of credit hours. You know, this almost seems like a throwaway comment, but many of you may have been involved, and certainly we have been involved in working with schools that have had findings of precisely this nature show up in program reviews and audits, and there can be this dispute with the department over whether a program is really appropriately categorized, for example, as distance ed, or if the assignment of credit hours is appropriate. And we thought it was significant here that the department has put in the law. I mean, this isn't guidance or commentary. Keep in mind, again, this is in the law as of July 1st, 2021. There is a legal deference under the regulation that's going to be given to the accrediting agency and state authorizing agencies' evaluation and determination on these fronts. We thought that was a really important point, and candidly was welcome. Eligibility determinations. The new rule also includes a couple of points in this regard and makes some changes in and around this concept of eligibility. First of all, and I thought this was prudent, the new rule actually puts an obligation on the department in the law to take prompt action on any material or complete application for initial eligibility. For any of you who have been trying to get applications through the U.S. Department of Education over the last 2 to 3 years, If you are anything like me, my experience at least has been that it is challenging and a lot of things are taking a long time. Now, there are many, many different reasons for that, and I want to be very clear that my impression is the folks over at the department who are responsible for processing these applications, for the most part, are working as hard as they can. I think they really do have the pedal to the metal. But whether it's for the complexity of the applications or staffing shortages or the pandemic, you name it, the fact of the matter is applications still have been taking a while to get processed, and I appreciated that the department actually included this language in the new rule. The rule also clarifies that the department can deny an institution's certification or recertification application if it is not financially responsible or does not timely submit its annual audits. Now, this concept was already indirectly in the law and already as a practical matter being exercised by the department. But I just wanted to highlight for folks, the department did take the extra step of clarifying quite explicitly in the law that if they have a concern about your financial responsibility or if your audits are not in timely, they could flat out deny certification or recertification. Okay, maximum program length. So the new rule, for a long time, there's been some, the language historically, actually the current law, I guess I should say, around maximum program length is a little vague. I think there's been a little confusion around this, the standard that your program length can't exceed, be 50% longer than the maximum length established by your state. The department understood that there was some confusion there around the way the current law was worded, and I think also understood that there were challenges for institutions that had students from multiple states, particularly if you are offering the type of program that tends to be pretty highly prescribed, and you've got an adjacent state, right, where it's expecting the folks who come back there to live and to work to have more education or an education that's graduated from a program that's longer. So the department actually in the new rule has revised this concept around maximum program length and clarified it a little bit in I think a positive way. And the new rule revises it to say a program can be 150% of the minimum number of clock hours required for training in a recognized occupation, for which a program prepares a student. I'm going to skip this, or, and this is the point I thought was really good too, the minimum number of clock hours required for training in the recognized occupation for which the program prepares a student is established in a state adjacent to the state in which the institution is located. So not a perfect solution, but certainly for some of the schools that have professional programs that are offered measured in clock hours, this should give you a little bit extra flexibility, hopefully, in making sure you don't run afoul this particular provision. Another topic that has created a lot of heartburn for schools over the last decade is the clock to credit hour conversion. Many of you will remember, and this is the conversion, if you've got a non-degree program that does not transfer entirely into a degree program that you offer and from which you've had individuals graduate, then your program is subject to the clock to credit hour conversion. And you have to use that conversion ultimately to determine how much financial aid can be processed for the students in that program. And the FA folks on the call know this rule intimately, at least if you've got non-degree programs at your campus. And about 7 or 8 years ago, the department in revising the regulations significantly complicated this concept. And there's discussion in the preamble to this rule where the department sort of talks about that history and why that happened. But the change where the department went from a fairly simple standard to one where schools had to meet new metrics but could incorporate outside of class time was really confusing, particularly for a lot of career schools, but for a lot of institutions outside of what I'll call really traditional higher ed, where you had programs that might not have a clear sort of outside component, or where it was very hard to sort of track how many outside of class hours students were really spending. And it created, again, a lot of heartache and heartburn for a number of institutions. And this administration basically said, you know what, it was complicated. There was a reason that it was done, but in retrospect, it has not made things easier. It has just made things confusing, and so we're getting rid of it. And so the new rule will revise, again, not effective until next July 1, but when it is effective, the new rule will revise and simplify that clock to credit hour conversion and really put it back to where it was 15 years ago, which is to simply state that for covered programs, and that's those non-degree programs that don't transfer entirely into degree programs, for covered non-degree programs, a semester or trimester hour must include at least 30 clock hours of instruction. Quarter hour must include at least 20 clock hours of instruction. And in the commentary, the department said, look, this change just eliminates the need for institutions to consider the number of homework hours associated with each credit hour in programs that are subject to the conversion. So if you're offering non-degree programs, hopefully you will see this as a welcome simplification. I suspect if your financial aid folks are listening, they most definitely will. But also keep in mind that you may need to have some conversation with your accreditor, or at least internally when this rule changes, to make sure that you are still comfortable with your conversions and what you're putting on your e-car. Okay, so this is the last slide of the presentation before we get to resources, and I'm going to do my best here not to get on my soapbox. I try to remember that our job is primarily to try to give good counsel and not to take positions as to the merit of regulations. But I will just tell you this particular rule that has popped up, I think is not a good rule. And I'm going to explain to you why. So the new rule modifies the existing past performance framework. And what that framework says is, and this is something the department uses, if you have someone who is in a position of ownership or control of an institution that closes, owing some amount to the department, and it's not being paid back, and you're not on some sort of payment plan or something, it's just a bad debt, so to speak, then you can't go and have an ownership or controlling interest in another institution. So it's the way that the department, essentially using this rule, keeps bad actors, right, those who've been responsible for closures or were in charge when closures happened and money was owed, from becoming involved with other institutions. Philosophically, that makes great sense. I mean, it's an important tool for the department, right? So the new rule modifies the existing past performance framework to provide that an institution is not financially responsible if a person who exercises substantial ownership or control over an institution also exercise substantial ownership or control over another institution, Title IV, that closed, quote, without a viable teach-out plan or agreement approved by the institution's accrediting agency and faithfully executed by the institution. Now, you may be saying, Aaron, why would you have a problem with this standard? Isn't it important that schools that are closing have viable teach-out plans and attempt to faithfully execute those teach-out plans? Of course. I have no issue with the underlying policy objective here. It's no secret that in higher education, even before the pandemic, there's some contraction occurring. There are a lot of institutions that are facing at least location closures, if not institution-wide closures, and it is absolutely critical that those institutions work to the best of their ability to develop, teach-out plans and arrangements, certainly for students, but also to try to help faculty and staff find places to go to the extent they can, to try to make as smooth a landing as can be made for everybody, to take care of the community where you have an important role in that community, and that when you develop this teach-out plan and you work with your accreditor and you get it approved, that you plan to faithfully execute it. All right. But here's my problem with this rule as a lawyer type and someone who works with institutions and at times defends them in front of the U.S. Department of Education. First of all, I don't know what a viable teach-out plan is, right? Because that concept is not defined. Nor do I know what it means to faithfully execute a teach-out plan. Those are totally squishy terms, and there's no definition that's included here. So, who knows if a regulator down the line, despite my best efforts and the teach-out plan I put into place and all the work I put in to execute it, might take the view that it was viable or faithfully executed, right? And if they take the view that it's not faithfully executed, despite all my efforts, does that mean that I now cannot have any sort of controlling or senior leadership position at another institution of higher ed? Because if I did, then it would no longer be deemed financially responsible. Or what if I presently am involved with various institutions? What if I'm at a university system that has multiple OPIDs underneath it, right? And one of my institutions closes, and for some reason the agency says, well, you didn't faithfully execute your teach-out plan. Now do I have to leave my job because I can no longer be in a position of management or control in the university system? So I have a real issue with these squishy terms, but let me give you some of my other concerns beyond the definition. What if a school is unable to execute on its approved teach-out plan because circumstances change? I mean, you could have a viable teach-out plan that relies on a university partner across town, and you could be midway through your teach-out, and they could say, you know what, circumstances have changed, we've got a pandemic, something else has occurred, we're no longer going to be able to take your students. What is it? Am I no longer faithfully executing on my teach-out plan because my partner left, and now I don't have another partner in town to whom I can send my students? You know, what if that partner decides to change the terms of our arrangement or change the program, right? And I decide to go elsewhere. Now I may not be executing on the teach-out plan that was originally proposed to my accreditor and approved because I've had to make a change halfway through, right? What if you have a landlord or creditor that takes action? I mean, you could have a situation where if you're a distressed institution, you may have a teach-out plan that calls for 6 months to a year, right? And you've talked with your creditor and you've got that plan in place and you're getting ready to announce the closure in the teach-out process, and your landlord decides to take action on one or two of the properties that you utilize, or some creditor or lender says, you know what, we're going to take action, and now what you planned can no longer be executed because you have half the cash flow or half the assets, etc. These are all circumstances beyond the institution's control, but they could materially impact your ability to execute the teach-out plan that was approved with your creditor or to faithfully execute that teach-out plan, right? And the fact of the matter is, particularly where you have a distressed institution that's facing closure, there are a lot of variables, right? And there are a lot of things beyond the institution's control that can occur in that context. What if you have a bunch of faculty that resign halfway through your teach-out plan because they have a better job or decide to go elsewhere? Or you have such a large number of students withdraw or transfer that you can no longer support a program that you had anticipated being to teach out for 4 or 5 months. Are you no longer faithfully executing your plan, or are you moving away from the plan that was approved by your creditor? And here's my favorite. Let's say that I'm an institution and I'm cash flow flat. So I'm just barely meeting my expenses, but I'm not in the red or in the black. We're getting it done. We're on HCM1 right now. We're in a space of distress, but we've planned to teach out. We've gone to our creditor. We've had the teach out plan approved. We've got a partner lined up. We're going to teach out over 8 months. And the U.S. Department of Education calls me and says, we know that you're in a bad situation. We know you're on the verge of teach out. Your creditor's got you on warning, so we're going to put you on HCM2. Well, wait a minute. Department, if you put me on HCM2, I'm not going to be able to access Title IV for 60 to 90 days as I transition to HCM2, and I can't survive on that, right? You're talking about 70%, 60% of my revenue stream that's now not going to be available over the next 2 or 3 months. If you do that, we won't be able to execute the teach-out plan we agreed to. We're going to face a precipitous closure. We can't even make payroll. Please don't do that. And the department says, we understand, but this is the only tool available to us. We're putting you on HCM2. Now, because of a regulatory action, you cannot execute on the teach-out plan that was approved by your accreditor. And you could have an aggressive regulator even take the position that you failed to faithfully execute. I have real concerns about this language. And, you know, I'm hopeful that there will be some revision down the road. There will be some discussion. But, you know, I think particularly with the number of institutions out there that are facing potential closure or contraction in the coming years, this is not a good standard and creates a tremendous amount of risk for institutions. I understand the underlying policy objective, and again, I do not disagree with it at all. But there need to be some considerations around institutions that are being faced with volatile month-over-month scenarios when they are trying to work through a teach-out, many of which are outside of their control, and there needs to be some understanding beyond just an implicit, well, you know, we're not going to take advantage of anyone who couldn't control the situation. There needs to be some understanding or carve out for good actors, and there's nothing there right now in this rule. So that's my soapbox. Thank you for listening to me, but I'm concerned about this rule. And if you think you are dealing with a distressed institution or working at one, I think you ought to be paying attention to this and thinking very hard about it. With all of that being said, deep breath. Let me just throw some resources at you real quickly. As always, we have all our webinars are recorded and available on demand, including webinars offered by other practices within the firm and prior webinars offered by the higher education practice. You are absolutely welcome to come check those out. We do have our blog up, Regucation, and are delighted for you to check that out, where we write about a lot of things and have been this summer. The other thing is when we have upcoming webinars or release materials that are free for the community, we'll often announce them on our blog, so it's a good thing to keep an eye on. I'll just highlight, we did a 6-part free Title IX training series that provides foundational training. So if you, the folks at your institution, are working on getting up to speed with the new Title IX rule and you're trying to figure out where you can get training, this training is specifically for adjudicators, investigators, coordinators, all the folks helping to administer the new process under the new rule. It's on YouTube. Again, it's totally free. So if you've been looking around for materials, we would love for you to check that out and take advantage of it. And then finally, we often have little things that we'll put out in the way of extra credit. Some of them are alerts. We have a new bar defense rule reporting guide that takes into account the July 1 changes that went into effect this year, and that will be coming out soon. Keep an eye out for that if you're responsible for those types of things. And then we also have a Title IX compliance checklist. If you go to our blog, in a recent blog, we talked about that and had a link to it, but it goes through a lot of the requirements, for example, under the new Title IX rule as well. All right, but I understand this is the distance education crowd. So all we've got left is a disclaimer. I'll let that just sit on the screen here as I took along with Katie to answer your questions. And so speaking of which, let's pull those up. And we do have a couple. Looks like we've got 15 or 20 here. So we'll just start, we'll start at the beginning. Okay. Are there, get this a little bigger. Are there distance education attendance requirements that schools must follow in regard to their distance education programs? We are a non-attendance taking institution. Does this apply to distance education programs? So the U.S. Department of Education, to my knowledge, somebody can call me out if I'm making a mistake here, but to my knowledge, the U.S. Department of Education does not have an attendance policy. And what I mean by that is they don't require you to take attendance, and they don't suggest that you should take attendance in a certain way. But you are required to have some way of determining, for example, last date of attendance, right? And that's where you get this question of, if you're not an attendance-taking institution, how do you do that? They also have requirements, if you do take attendance, regarding exactly, how you should manage R2T4 and things along those lines. So there are different policies at the department that take into account this notion of attendance and, how many days somebody's been gone, et cetera. But they don't actually require you to take attendance. So in that sense, they don't have an attendance policy. They also, by the way, hopefully it goes without saying, but if they ever come on campus to do a program review or an audit, they're going to want to take a look at your attendance policy and make sure, if you have one, that you are following it. What they do require in the way of distance education is a lot of the stuff we just talked about. So, you have to have a way of establishing regular and substantive interaction, for example. If you are an attendance-taking institution and you're offering online programs, then you have to have some way of establishing that folks are actually complying with your attendance policy, for example. So I know that in some respects, as a practical matter, it seems like those lines sometimes it may seem like there's a distinction without a difference, but it is important, again, to note that the U.S. Department of Education does not mandate an attendance policy for anyone, but they do have a lot of mechanics built around whether you are taking attendance or not taking attendance. That may not have been a very satisfactory answer. If you want follow-up, just give me a holler. Katie, anything to add on that, by the way? I don't mean to preclude you there.
Nope, you're fine. I will absolutely chime in, but I'm going to let you take the reins, and I'll chime in if I have something to add. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. If we offer correspondence courses, are we no longer allowed to call our courses distance education? So I'm glad you asked that question. It's a great question. We were focused in this presentation on the department's new definition of distance education. And that's really what we talked about here specifically and entirely. But one of the focuses of the new rule was to draw a distinction between what constitutes correspondence courses and what constitutes distance education courses. So there are very specific definitions for each, and the obligations that attach to each are different. So, and there are certain types of restrictions that apply if you're offering correspondence instead of distance education, et cetera. So one of the real aims of this rulemaking was to help make that distinction more clear. We didn't focus on that here, but if you believe that you are offering correspondence courses, I would strongly suggest that you consult the new rule and look hard at the changes. Remember, it goes effect July 1, 2021. So this isn't happening tomorrow, or it didn't happen last week, but in the time between now and then, certainly you want to take a hard look and think about, are we offering distance education programs or are we offering correspondence courses? And at least in terms of, you're going to want to make sure you understand from the department's perspective which one you're offering so that you are complying with the department's rules in the appropriate way. There's sort of a separate question as to what you might call them externally to students enrolling. I mean, so we're sort of distinguishing between what the department thinks of it and how you comply with Title IV regulations, and then sort of separately marketing and how you might represent your programs externally to the community and prospective students. The department obviously has standards around misrepresentation. States have consumer protection statutes. You wouldn't want to call something distance education and risk running afoul of one of those standards and having someone say, well, you told me it was one thing and it was another. But I'll also say the line between distance ed and correspondence sometimes, at least in the general public's mind, may be unclear. The department has worked really hard in the Title IV context to make that line clear, right? But I don't know that calling something a distance education offering when the department may categorize it officially as correspondence would necessarily be a misrepresentation. I think that's something you're going to have to think about. But the first exercise is, under the department's new definitions, are you correspondence or are you distance education? And making sure that you know which you are and you're complying with the right framework. And then secondarily, I think there is this question of, can we still call it distance education, or do we think that someone might believe we were, for some reason, not being forward or entirely clear if we did that? And that's a secondary consideration that you'll have to take into account. All right. Do you think the department will extend the temporary distance ed provision beyond December 31st, 2020? All right, so give me a second. I'm going to pick up my crystal ball, put it on the table. Okay. I don't know better than anybody else. I mean, here's what I'll tell you. I do think this. I think that the department and the other regulators know that they have a lot of institutions around the country right now that are not traditional distance education providers and are providing distance education programming because of the pandemic, obviously, because they moved in that direction so they could keep offering their programming. And that's why all those flexibilities were created. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, to the contrary, that was the idea, and that's why we put all that temporary stuff into place. There are also a huge percentage of those institutions that continue to offer programming via distance education because of where we are with the pandemic. And, I don't think it makes any sense for the regulators to suddenly cut off all those temporary provisions. One, if the pandemic is still ongoing and there's any significant population of institutions that needs to continue offering the distance education, but also you don't want to hurt all those students, right? I mean, if you just ended all the temporary provisions as of December 31 and you've got, 60-70% of your school population still trying to figure out if spring's going to be online or not, and now they don't even have that option, and all the students who've been online and maybe even started online suddenly can't go online, I just think it would be a disaster. In my mind, the reasonable and prudent course for the regulators, I would think, would be likely to extend until you get to a point where all the institutions that have been offering online education under this sort of temporary construct have either had a reasonable opportunity to return on ground and to transition their students on ground, or a reasonable opportunity to take advantage of some sort of, I'll say, on-ramp into permanent online education. And that's the other thing I want to comment on. I think that the regulatory community is going to have to give real deliberate thought to how you get institutions that want to do that want to go from I'm online for the first time but under the temporary stuff to I want to continue online under the standard framework. They need some sort of on-ramp that allows them to get there and doesn't create an unneeded disruption. You know, you don't want to have a situation where, well, we know your application's pending, but it's going to be 3 months till we can consider it. So in the interim, the temporary stuff's done. So all your students are going to have to go back on ground, and then you can put them all back online 3 months from now if we approve you. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? So I think there's going to have to be some sort of on-ramp to get to regular online approval. And I think the regulators are still trying to figure that out. By the way, I don't mean to make them out to be the bad guys. Those guys are working hard. You know, I mean, they have been trying to figure all this out in real time, just like all the schools have and the whole community has. And, you know, I know it's a lot of us in the regulated community, the folks who do what I do, or have been frustrated sometimes by the delay in guidance or guidance that comes along quite late in the game. But I do know from many firsthand conversations, and I'm sure many of you do as well, that the regulators, they're just people. You know, they put on their pants one leg at a time, and they're doing their best to figure all this stuff out and get guidance out as well from home, you know, and they've got kids that are being educated in their living rooms just like mine are, and, you know, so we're all in it together, and I think they're doing the best they can. But I don't think it would make sense to pull the rug out from under the community, which leads me to believe that it will go beyond December 31. Can interaction, this is a great question. Okay, so I assume this person is talking about the regular interaction concept. It says, can this interaction include automated feedback based on a student's behavior? Boy, do I have a response for you. So it just so happens I cut and pasted this out of the Federal Register, the commentary earlier today. So the department actually says in the commentary, in that concept of interaction, they include a category for other interactive computer-assisted instruction. And here's what they had to say in the commentary, because this very question was asked during the comment period, and so it was addressed in the final rule. The department says, as the department discussed in the preamble to the notice of proposed rulemaking, we consider other interactive computer-assisted instruction to include the use of artificial intelligence or other adaptive learning tools, where the student is receiving feedback from technology-mediated instruction. Computer-assisted instruction would also include instruction through virtual or augmented reality or other forms of instruction in which a student actively participates in a computer-based or computer-mediated learning environment with or without the presence of a human instructor. How about that? So that seems like a pretty on-spot response. I have to say, in all the years I've been doing this, I've never had that happen. But that was great, so hopefully that was helpful. Let's see. I wonder how the documentation related to regular and substantive differs by primary modality, asynchronous or synchronous. Yeah, that's a great, I mean, I don't know if that's so much a question. It seems like more of an out loud wondering, but I think it's a good one, and appreciate it. And I would say I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot to be explored and understood regarding how the department is going to evaluate whether or not you're satisfying these requirements, you know, and what kind of documentation they will be looking at. I think it absolutely will vary from one type of program to another, you know, distance education, hybrid, a lot of synchronous, a little bit of synchronous, all asynchronous, right? I mean, I think it's really going to depend. And they talked about, you know, we're going to look at program design and all those kinds of what's scheduled, what types of interactions are built into the design itself of the program. And, you know, I think all of that has yet to be determined. I am hopeful, based on some of the comments in the Federal Register that I read to you, that suggested to me that some of these concepts around monitoring and evaluation might be reasonable. I don't know that they bind. In fact, I do know that they do not bind subsequent administrations. So I don't know if, you know, one administration after another will continue to be reasonable, what they'll want to see when they're doing evaluation and enforcement exercises. But I will say this, if you are in this space in a big way or wanting to move into this space in a big way, these concepts need to be at the core of your program design. So when you sit down to create an online program, you know, whoever's responsible for understanding these concepts needs to be at the table briefing those folks. And it needs to be built in when you're designing the program. Regular and substantive interaction needs to be built in, right? And concepts around monitoring and demonstrating and documenting regular and substantive interaction need to be built in. And that probably means your IT folks need to be there. You know, if you got an OPM or a third-party provider, you need to know what they're doing and how they're going to do it. I'll also throw this out. For those of you that are using third-party providers to build these platforms and host them, you might want to go back to your contracts and see what they say about, you know, Title IV compliance and whether they make any reference to regular and substantive interaction. I have to tell you, on a go-forward basis, certainly, if I'm assisting an institution negotiate a contract like that, one of the things I would like to see in a perfect world is some sort of provision acknowledging in the body of the contract that the provider understands this concept and warrants that their platform has the ability to provide, you know, regular and substantive interaction and to monitor and document regular substantive interaction. And maybe on my Christmas list, some sort of indemnification provision in the event that the department comes in and disagrees. Let's see. Can you repeat the monitoring examples? That was fast. I know, you know, I'm from Louisiana, but I've been told for a guy from Louisiana, I talk pretty quickly. So I'll go through it again. And this is in the Federal Register, in the commentary accompanying the rule. Monitoring could include evaluating a student's level of participation in synchronous class sessions, but it could also involve monitoring the student's activity on course websites or materials, considering the quality of the student's assignments or responses to questions about course materials, evaluating the level of the student's understanding of course materials during conversations with instructors or performance on exams, or other forms of monitoring the student's engagement and success in the course or competency. By the way, if you pull down the slides and you go to the timeline, remember at the beginning of the presentation, there was a grid and it had a timeline. And there was one entry for on September 2nd, 2020, the department publishes the final rule. There's a link there. If you click that link, it'll bring up the Federal Register that has this. So you've got it in the slides. If you pull down the slides, and then if you go and you do a search on the Federal Register page for monitoring could include, it'll pop right up. Let's see. Will you send us those two glosses? I'm not sure what that is, but if you will email me and tell me what glosses is, I will definitely send it to you if I have glosses. Does the regular and substantive interaction requirements for distance ed programs also apply to competency-based education CBE programs? Yes, if they're offered via distance education. That's, I haven't researched that particular question, but you can have competency-based education that is not offered online, right? And then you can have competency-based education. And we often associate it with online, but it doesn't have to be. But if it is offered, if it meets the definition of distance education, so it's CBE, but it's distance education, then I would believe that it is absolutely subject to the regular and substantive interaction requirements, as augmented by the particular rules for, and I'll say you're using the term here, the questioner uses competency-based education. The department doesn't really use that term so much. Where they really draw their line is between direct assessment programs, which of course is a type of competency-based education, and non-direct assessment programs. I think their view is if it's not a direct assessment program, if it's CBE, but it still uses clock hour, credit hour sort of framework, it's just subject to the regular regulatory framework, right? Where they really draw the line is if it's a direct assessment program. But when you ask about regular and substantive, that applies to any distance ed program. So if you're offering it, whether it's direct assessment or not direct assessment, if it's distance education, I believe the answer is yes. Does academic engagement have to include all the activities listed or at least one of the listed activities? That is a great question. So the definition of academic engagement includes all of those ideas. And your obligation to demonstrate, and it must include all of the stuff that says include. And your obligation to have regular and substantive interaction, among other things, is to, quote, monitor for academic engagement. But I understand the question. The question is, okay, we understand that all this different stuff constitutes academic engagement, and we understand we have to have a platform that is monitoring for academic engagement. But do we have to monitor for all that stuff? What if some of the stuff doesn't actually exist in our program, right, because of the design of the program? I mean, I understand if one of these concepts exists, then that it is considered part of the definition of academic engagement, but all of them might not actually exist for your program. You know, I think that's a squirrely notion, and it sort of calls, I mean, I get the question exactly, and I've thought about this myself. You know, it calls the question, if to the extent all of these different activities that are part of this definition of academic engagement exist within your program, and you want to demonstrate regular and substantive interaction, which means you have to be able to monitor for academic engagement, do you have to be able to monitor for all of those activities all the time? You know, the discussion that I read earlier from the department kind of suggests to me that you may not, right? I mean, they talk about the requirement for monitoring is not intended to mandate that instructors personally monitor each student's engagement throughout each class session. That's a quote that's right out of the Federal Register. Instead, the requirement's intended to ensure that instructors are generally monitoring whether a student is engaged and successful throughout a given course. I mean, that doesn't sound to me like the expectation is that you are required to monitor and record every time one of those things occurs. I don't know. It's an interesting question, and one that I think we're going to have to figure out as a community. I mean, or does it mean your platform has to be able to monitor for them, even though you don't actually have to document when all of them occur, right? So it's one thing to be able to say, yes, we can monitor and see when all that happens, but we don't document every single time one of these included concepts occurs, right? We just periodically check and utilize that capability, that ability to monitor, right? It's just kind of like on the other side of things where the department says you don't actually have to record and document every single interaction between this, you know, scheduled interaction, but you have to have a platform and a program designed to offer regular interaction, scheduled interaction, right? So I think there are some great questions here. You guys have asked a ton of them. We're at the bottom of the hour, so I'm going to make that the last question. But sure appreciate everybody tuning in. Please consider tuning in next time around for the cybersecurity panel. I think it's going to be excellent. Otherwise, I will just say, and for me and Katie and everyone here at Thompson Coburn, please be safe and be well.